As wildfires ravage Los Angeles, Barron Trump watches helplessly until he makes a bold decision that shocks the world. From a heartfelt prayer to a daring journey into the disaster zone, his actions spark a wave of hope. But when a desperate little girl pleads for help, Barron takes an even greater risk. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The television flickered with scenes of devastation, flames roaring through once thriving neighborhoods, thick clouds of black smoke swallowing the Los Angeles skyline, and families clutching whatever few possessions they had managed to save. The inferno showed no mercy, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. Emergency sirens wailed as firefighters braved the relentless heat, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. In every corner of the city, despair hung heavy in the air, thick as the smoke rising into the darkened sky. Seated in the comfort of his home in Florida, Barron Trump watched the unfolding disaster in stunned silence. The usual warmth of Mar-a-Lago's golden sunset felt hollow as the screen flashed images of broken families, parents desperately searching for their children, an elderly couple staring in disbelief at the ruins of their home, and a young girl no older than 6, Emily, crying over the loss of her beloved dog, Scout, who had disappeared in the chaos. Barron's grip tightened around his phone. It wasn't just sadness gnawing at him, it was anger. Anger at the sheer unfairness of it all. Why did this have to happen? Why were these people suffering while the rest of the world just watched? He turned off the television abruptly, unable to bear another moment of the tragedy replaying before his eyes. He glanced around his room. Safe, untouched, pristine. A sharp pang of guilt struck him. While he sat in comfort, thousands had just lost everything. His breath felt shallow, his chest tight with emotion. His mother, Melania Trump, entered the room quietly, sensing the shift in her son's mood. She had seen that expression before, the look of a young man wrestling with something far bigger than himself. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "What's wrong, Barron?" He turned to face her, his usually composed expression cracking under the weight of what he felt. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I need to do something, anything." There was desperation in his tone, a raw, unfiltered urgency that surprised even him. Melanie studied his face for a moment before nodding. "What do you have in mind?" Barron hesitated. The truth was he didn't know, not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to act. He had grown up watching his father, Donald Trump, command rooms and make things happen, but this wasn't about politics or power. This was about human lives. That night, sleep refused to come. Barron lay awake, his mind replaying the images of devastation like a never-ending reel of sorrow. He imagined what it must feel like to lose everything, to wake up one morning with a home, a life, and a sense of security, only to have it all snatched away by flames in the blink of an eye. Finally, after what felt like hours, he pushed back his blanket and sank to his knees beside his bed. He took a deep breath, clasped his hands together, and whispered into the stillness of the night, "God, please help them." The night was silent, but Barron's heart was anything but. He remained on his knees, his hands clasped together in quiet desperation. He wasn't just praying, he was pleading for the families who had lost everything, for the firefighters risking their lives, for the children crying in the arms of parents who no longer knew how to comfort them. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet every word carried the weight of a soul determined to make a difference. "God, please help the families in Los Angeles. Give them strength, comfort, and hope. Protect the firefighters, the rescue workers, the people who are struggling. Let them know they are not alone." Unbeknownst to him, his mother stood just outside the door, her hand resting on the frame. Melania had always known Barron to be introspective and reserved, but there was something different about this moment. This wasn't just a passing moment of sympathy, this was conviction. Her son wasn't simply feeling sorry for these people, he was carrying their grief as if it were his own. A soft smile of admiration crossed her lips as she stepped away, reaching for her phone. This was a side of Barron that few had seen, and she knew the world needed to hear it. She dialed a trusted friend in the media. "The world needs to hear his words," she said softly. By morning, the world had indeed heard them. When Barron woke up the next day, something was different. His phone buzzed relentlessly on his nightstand, the notifications stacking up faster than he could process. Confused, he reached for it and blinked at the overwhelming flood of messages, trending hashtags, and news headlines. Barron Trump's emotional prayer for wildfire victims goes viral. A president's son, a nation's prayer. A young man's words ignite a movement. His heart pounded. His prayer had been recorded and shared online. Millions had seen it. People were talking, sharing his words, reacting with overwhelming emotion. The comments were endless. "This is what leadership looks like. I haven't prayed in years, but this made me fall to my knees. I lost my home, but knowing people like Barron Trump care gives me hope." He scrolled further and saw something that made his breath hitch. Videos of wildfire victims watching his prayer from the shelters. Families huddled together, some crying, others simply holding hands in quiet gratitude. A firefighter, his face streaked with ash, whispered, "Amen," as the video ended. His hands trembled. He had only meant to pray for them, to ask for guidance, but somehow his words had done more. Melania entered the room, her expression calm but knowing. "The world heard you," she said. Barron looked up, his mind still spinning. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he admitted. She sat beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. And that's exactly why it mattered. The realization sank in. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about going viral or trending online. This was about the people suffering in Los Angeles, the ones with nowhere to go, the ones who had lost everything. And if his words could give them even an ounce of strength, he wasn't going to stop now. "I want to do more," he said suddenly, the determination rising in his chest. "I want to go there, to Los Angeles." Melania studied his face carefully. She had seen the risks of stepping into the public eye, the dangers that came with being a Trump, and the scrutiny that followed every move they made. But looking into her son's eyes, she knew this wasn't a moment to shelter him. It was a moment to support him. She nodded. "Then let's make it happen." Within hours, the wheels were set in motion. Security teams mobilized, calls were made, and plans were drawn. A trip like this into a disaster zone was no small feat, especially for the son of a former president. But this wasn't about politics. This wasn't about making headlines. This was about helping people. That evening, as the final details were being arranged, Barron stood outside, gazing up at the sky. A faint trail of smoke from the west was visible even from Florida, a stark reminder of the destruction still raging. He closed his eyes and whispered the same prayer again. Tomorrow, he would not just watch. Tomorrow, he would act. Barron Trump had been on many flights in his life, but this one felt different. The hum of the private jet was steady, but inside his chest, his heart pounded with an urgency he hadn't known before. He sat by the window, staring at the horizon where the thick smoke of the Los Angeles wildfires blurred the sky into a suffocating haze. From up here, the world seemed so vast, yet down below, lives were being shattered in an instant. Homes turned to ashes, memories erased, and futures left uncertain. The Secret Service agents seated nearby monitored him carefully, their professional stoicism unwavering. They had been assigned to protect him, but Barron wasn't looking for protection. He was looking for purpose. Melania sat across from him, her expression unreadable, but he knew she was watching, observing, understanding more than he ever had to say. Finally, she broke the silence. "You ready for this?" she asked, not as a mother questioning her son's resolve, but as someone who needed to know just how far he was willing to go. Barron turned to her, his jaw set. "Yes." No hesitation, no second thoughts. She nodded, satisfied. "Then let's make sure we do it right." As the plane began its descent, the devastation became clearer. Miles of land scorched black, neighborhoods nothing but skeletal remains, roads blocked by emergency vehicles. Even from the air, the destruction was overwhelming. Barron exhaled sharply. This was worse than he had imagined. Upon landing at a private airport outside the disaster zone, the tension in the air was palpable. Security teams moved swiftly, ensuring the area was secure. A convoy of SUVs was waiting for them, engines idling, ready to take them where they needed to go. "Stay close," a security officer instructed as Barron and Melania stepped off the plane. Barron barely acknowledged him. His focus was forward, his mind already in the shelters where people were waiting for something, anything, to remind them that they weren't alone. The drive into the city was eerily quiet, aside from the distant sound of sirens. Los Angeles, the city of dreams, now looked like a war zone. Barron watched through the tinted glass as families stood outside what used to be their homes, some sifting through the rubble, others simply staring at the remains, too numb to cry. He clenched his fists. "This isn't fair," he muttered under his breath. Melania, who had been quiet during the ride, finally spoke. "Life rarely is." The SUVs slowed as they neared the first evacuation shelter, a repurposed high school gymnasium. Outside, volunteers handed out blankets, food, and bottled water. A line stretched down the block, families waiting for supplies. Barron's stomach twisted. "This is where it starts," Melania said softly, knowing her son needed no further prompting. As he stepped out of the car, heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. It was one thing to see Barron Trump on TV. It was another to see him here, in the middle of it all. A small boy, no older than 8, broke free from his mother's grasp and ran up to Barron, his face streaked with ash and tears. "Are you here to help us?" the boy asked, clutching a stuffed bear missing an ear. Barron knelt so they were at eye level. "I'm here to listen, to pray, and to make sure you know you're not alone." The boy's lower lip trembled. Behind him, his mother gasped softly before bursting into tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Just thank you." Barron gave the boy's bear a gentle squeeze before standing up, scanning the faces of those around him. Fear, grief, exhaustion, hope. He saw it all. One by one, people stepped forward, their voices trembling as they shared their stories. An elderly couple, married for 50 years, had lost their home, the only home they had ever known. A teenage girl recounted how she had run for her life with her baby sister in her arms, not knowing if her parents would make it out in time. A father, his hands rough and blistered, had spent days digging through the rubble for any piece of his family's past. But it was the story of a little girl named Emily that shook Barron to his core. She sat on a cot, her small fingers clutching a worn photograph of a golden retriever, Max, the dog she had grown up with, the dog who had disappeared in the fire. "I just want Max back," she whispered. "He's my best friend." Barron swallowed hard, his throat tight. He couldn't promise her that Max would be found. He couldn't tell her everything would be okay, but he could do something. Turning to his security detail, he whispered instructions. Within seconds, they were making calls, coordinating with rescue teams, local shelters, animal control, searching for Max. Emily looked up at him, her teary eyes filled with something fragile, hope. Barron sat beside her. "I'll do everything I can," he promised. For the first time, she smiled. The moment was small, but it ignited something within Barron. This wasn't about showing up. It was about showing up for them. As the day stretched into evening, Barron found himself in the middle of a circle of evacuees. A woman approached hesitantly. "Would you pray with us?" she asked. The request caught him off guard, but he nodded without hesitation. The group held hands. The gymnasium, once filled with quiet sobs and hushed conversations, fell into reverent silence. Barron took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "Dear God," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "thank you for bringing us together tonight. Please watch over everyone who has lost their home, their belongings, and their sense of security. Give them strength, give them hope, and remind them that they are not alone. Soft echoes of "Amen" filled the air. Some wiped away tears. Others simply closed their eyes, taking comfort in the words. Barron felt something shift. This was bigger than him. This was bigger than anything he had ever known. As he stepped away, a firefighter, his face streaked with soot, approached him. "You don't know what this means to them," the man said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "What it means to us." Barron met his gaze. "What do you need?" he asked. The firefighter hesitated. "People don't realize what we go through, the loss, the exhaustion. We just need people to remember us, too." Barron nodded. He wouldn't forget. That night, as he lay in a cot in a makeshift room at the shelter, his mind raced. The day had been overwhelming, heartbreaking, and more emotional than he had ever anticipated. And yet, as he closed his eyes, one thought kept repeating in his mind. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Barron Trump awoke to the sound of muffled voices just outside his makeshift shelter room. For a brief moment, as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he almost forgot where he was. But then the faint smell of smoke in the air reminded him, this wasn't a dream, this was reality. He swung his legs over the side of the cot, stretched his tired limbs, and pulled on his hoodie. The night had been restless. The weight of the stories he had heard, the sorrow he had seen in people's eyes, clung to him like a shadow. But he knew that self-pity had no place here. There was work to do. Stepping outside into the cold morning air, he found himself met with an unexpected sight. A line of people, all waiting, not for food or supplies, but to speak with him. Mothers clutching their children, elderly couples leaning on each other for support, exhausted firefighters still in their ash-streaked uniforms. All stood silently, their faces filled with hope. A woman stepped forward first, her hands wringing together anxiously. She was in her 40s, her clothes covered in soot, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the cameras, not for the headlines, but for being here, for listening." Barron looked at her and shook his head. "No need to thank me," he said earnestly. "I just wish I could do more." She nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "You already have." The crowd murmured in agreement. It was overwhelming. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. He had come because he felt helpless watching from a distance, but here, standing among people who had lost everything, he realized the truth. Sometimes, being present was enough. But then, just as he was about to respond, a voice called out from behind the crowd. "Barron." It was one of the rescue coordinators. His tone was urgent. Barron immediately excused himself and rushed over. "We found something," the man said. Barron's pulse quickened. "Max?" The coordinator nodded. "We think so. A golden retriever matching the description was spotted near an abandoned neighborhood last night. He was weak, but alive." Barron didn't hesitate. "Take me there." A short drive later, Barron found himself at a makeshift animal rescue station. Volunteers were tending to dozens of displaced pets, some burned, some scared, others too weak to even move. The scene was heartbreaking. Then, in the farthest kennel, Barron saw him. A golden retriever lay curled up on a blanket, his fur singed, his eyes dull with exhaustion. But the moment Max lifted his head, as if recognizing the presence of something familiar, Barron knew. It was him. Barron immediately turned to the staff. "How soon can we get him back to Emily?" One of the volunteers smiled. "Right now, if you'd like." Barron crouched beside Max, gently running his fingers through the dog's fur. "You're going home, buddy," he whispered. The drive back to the shelter was tense. Barron couldn't shake the thought of what it would mean to Emily. She had lost her home, her life had been turned upside down. But maybe, just maybe, Max would give her the piece of hope she so desperately needed. As they pulled up to the shelter, word had already spread. People gathered outside, whispering excitedly. A group of children stood near the entrance, eyes wide with anticipation. Barron stepped out of the vehicle, gently guiding Max out with him. And then, There she was. Emily. The moment her eyes met Max's, her entire world shifted. "Max!" she screamed, bolting forward, her tiny legs carrying her faster than Barron thought possible. The dog, weak as he was, found the strength to stand. His tail wagged furiously, and as soon as Emily threw her arms around him, he licked her face, whining with joy. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Barron couldn't move. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He had never seen a purer moment of happiness. Emily sobbed into Max's fur, clutching him like she'd never let go. And maybe she never would. Barron turned to one of the volunteers. "Let's make sure she has everything she needs for him. Food, a vet checkup, whatever it takes." The woman smiled through tears. "Already on it." As the scene unfolded, a reporter standing among the onlookers stepped forward. "Mr. Trump," she said softly, "you've been here for days, listening to people, praying with them, even helping reunite them with what they've lost. But you're only 17. Why do this when most teenagers would be anywhere but here?" Barron paused, glancing at Emily, still sobbing into Max's fur. "Because I couldn't just watch and do nothing," he said finally. The reporter nodded. "And what do you hope comes from your visit here?" Barron's gaze turned back to the crowd, faces still lined with sorrow, but now also with hope. "That people don't forget," he said. "Not tomorrow, not next week. That they remember these people need help long after the cameras leave." His words struck deep. A firefighter, still wearing his gear, stepped forward, placing a hand on Barron's shoulder. "You don't just give people hope, kid," he said. "You remind them they're worth it." The crowd was silent. Some nodded. Others wiped away tears. For Barron, that was enough. That night, as he lay in his cot once more, he thought about everything that had happened. About Emily, about Max, about the people who had lost everything but still found the strength to stand. And he knew this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The night after Barron Trump reunited Emily with her beloved dog Max, the atmosphere at the shelter shifted. There was still sadness, still exhaustion, but for the first time since he had arrived, there was also something else. Hope. Word had spread beyond the shelter walls, beyond Los Angeles. The internet was ablaze with the story of Barron's visit, his prayer, his presence, and his undeniable sincerity. Thousands of messages poured in from around the country, people offering donations, support, and even homes to displaced families. Despite the exhaustion pulling at his body, Barron couldn't sleep. He scrolled through his phone, seeing post after post of strangers stepping up to help. A woman in Texas offering to take in a family with small children, a retired contractor in Arizona pledging to rebuild houses for free, college students organizing donation drives for clothes and supplies. Something bigger than himself was happening. Then an idea struck him. Grabbing his phone, he quickly typed out a message to his mother, Melania Trump, who had been keeping track of his every move since he arrived. "Mom, I need your help with something. Call me when you wake up." Satisfied, he set the phone aside and stared at the ceiling. The smell of smoke was still faint in the air, a reminder of the devastation that lingered. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Please, let this work." The next morning, as the sun barely peeked over the horizon, Barron was already up, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, speaking with one of the shelter coordinators. "I want to do more than just visit," he explained. "The people here, they're grateful, but they need long-term help. The moment the media moves on, so will the donations. That can't happen." The woman, a seasoned disaster relief worker, nodded slowly. "It's true," she admitted. "The hardest part isn't the fire itself. It's the months, even years, of rebuilding that no one sticks around for." Barron's jaw tightened. "Then I will." The woman blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Barron took a deep breath, determination burning in his eyes. "I want to create a relief fund. Something that will keep going even after I leave. Not just for this fire, but for every disaster that leaves families stranded." Before the woman could respond, his phone buzzed. "Melania?" "Mom," he answered. "Barron, what are you trying to do?" Her voice was firm but filled with curiosity. "I need help starting something real," he explained. "Not just a temporary fundraiser, but a movement. I don't know how to do it alone." A pause, then, "You don't have to." By the end of the call, plans were already in motion. Hours later, Barron sat in front of a borrowed laptop, going live to the world. The screen flickered as the broadcast began. He adjusted his hoodie, his face more serious than most had ever seen it. "Hey everyone," he started. "I don't usually do this. I'm not a politician. I'm not here to make speeches. But I am here because people need help." The comments started pouring in. "Barron, we're watching. Tell us what we can do. We love what you're doing." He swallowed hard, emotions pressing at his throat. "I've been here for days and I've met people who have lost everything. I've prayed with them, I've cried with them, and I've seen what real strength looks like. But they need more than words. They need action." He took a deep breath. "That's why I'm launching the Rise Again Relief Fund." The chat exploded. "What? No way Barron is really doing this? How do we donate?" "This fund will go directly to families who've lost their homes. Not just here in Los Angeles, but wherever disaster strikes," Barron continued. "If you can give, please do. If you can't, share this. Let the world know that we don't leave people behind." He ended the stream, his heart pounding. For a moment there was silence. Then, his phone lit up. Donations were already coming in. Within hours, the world responded. Celebrities retweeted Barron's video, pledging thousands. Athletes, actors, even rival politicians. People who rarely agreed on anything all came together to support the cause. By that evening, the fund had raised over $2 million. But Barron wasn't done. That night, he met with Captain David Morales, a fire chief who had spent weeks battling the relentless flames. The man's face was lined with exhaustion, his uniform stained with soot. "Captain," Barron greeted, shaking his hand firmly. "Mr. Trump," Morales replied, "heard you've been making some waves." Barron smiled slightly. "Trying." The two sat on a bench outside the fire station, watching as weary firefighters cleaned their equipment, preparing for another grueling day. "What you guys do, it's unbelievable," Barron said. "I wanted to ask, what's the one thing people don't understand about this job?" Captain Morales exhaled, staring at the ground. "That it doesn't end when the fire's out," he said. "The physical burns heal, but the emotional scars, they last." Barron nodded. "I want to help with that too." The captain raised a brow. Barron leaned forward. "Mental health services for first responders. I want part of the fund to go toward that." Captain Morales was speechless. "You'd really do that?" Barron's gaze was unwavering. "Yes." By the next morning, another press release had gone out. The Rise Again Relief Fund wouldn't just help fire victims, it would also provide mental health support for firefighters and first responders. The donations doubled. News anchors across the country spoke about Barron's efforts. In a time where so many people talk about change, Barron Trump is actually doing it, one host admitted. But for Barron, the headlines didn't matter. What mattered was the people. That evening, as he walked back into the shelter, he saw something that made every effort worth it. Emily was sitting at a table, her hand clutching Max's fur, but for the first time since he met her, she was smiling. And that was everything. Barron had come to Los Angeles because he felt helpless. Now he was leaving, having started something bigger than himself. As he packed his things, ready to return home, his phone buzzed one last time. A text message from his father. "Donald Trump, proud of you, son. You didn't just watch, you acted." Barron stared at the message for a long moment before finally typing back. "It was never about me, it was about them." And for the first time in days, he finally felt at peace. The night before Barron Trump was set to leave Los Angeles, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the small cot set up for him in the shelter, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmurs of families around him. Some were whispering prayers, others comforting their children, and some sat in complete silence, their grief too heavy to put into words. Barron turned onto his side, his mind racing. He had come here to offer what little he could, a prayer, a presence, a moment of hope. But now, things had escalated into something much bigger. The Rise Again Relief Fund was already past $5 million, and organizations from across the country had reached out to partner with him. Yet something still felt unfinished. Then, a faint sound caught his ear. A quiet sniffle, barely audible in the stillness of the night. Sitting up, Barron glanced across the dimly lit shelter. At the far end of the room, near a stack of folded blankets, he saw a young woman sitting alone, her shoulders trembling. She was clutching something in her hands, holding it to her chest, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Without hesitation, Barron slipped out of bed, pulling on his hoodie, and made his way toward her. He recognized her immediately. Sophia, the mother who had been reunited with her teenage son just 2 nights before. She had wept in front of everyone, holding her son so tightly as if afraid he'd disappear again. But now, she looked just as broken as she had before that reunion. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Barron's voice was soft, careful not to startle her. The woman looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the flickering light of a nearby lantern. In her hands, she clutched a worn, crumpled letter. "Barron," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what are you doing awake?" "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "And I saw you sitting here. Are you okay?" Sophia let out a shaky breath, brushing away fresh tears. She unfolded the letter with trembling fingers and held it out to him. "This," she whispered, "is all I have left of my husband." Barron hesitated, but she nodded, giving him permission to take it. Carefully, he smoothed out the letter and began to read. The handwriting was slightly faded, written in blue ink on yellowed paper. "My dearest Sophia, by the time you read this, I'll be out on another call. Fires don't wait, and neither do the people who need us. But I need you to know something. Every time I step into those flames, I do it knowing that I have something worth coming home to. You and our son. You're my reason for coming back, always. Love, James." Barron's heart clenched. He looked up at Sophia, his throat tight. "Your husband," she swallowed hard, her gaze distant. "He was a firefighter. One of the first responders. He didn't make it." Barron felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. Sophia forced a smile through her tears. "I used to get mad at him for leaving those notes," she admitted. "I'd tell him to just say those things in person, but now it's all I have left." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Barron did something unexpected. He reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out the small wooden cross given to him earlier by an elderly man at the shelter. He held it out to Sophia. "I want you to have this," he said. Sophia shook her head. "Barron, I can't take that. It was a gift to you." Barron's expression was unwavering. "And now, I'm giving it to you because I think you need it more." Tears welled in Sophia's eyes, but she slowly reached out and took the cross, holding it tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Barron gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You're not alone. I know it feels like it sometimes, but you're not." Sophia nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. I think I needed to hear that." Barron sat with her for a few more minutes, listening as she shared stories about James, how they met, how he used to burn dinner every time he tried to cook, how he always left little handwritten notes around the house. By the time Barron returned to his cot, he finally felt at peace. The next morning, the shelter was bustling. Families were moving around, packing what little they had, talking about the next steps. Some were going to temporary housing, others were still waiting on updates about their homes. Barron stood near the entrance, taking it all in. He had spent days here, yet it felt like a lifetime. Leaving already? He turned to see Captain David Morales, the exhausted fire chief he had met the day before. The man's uniform was still covered in soot, but his posture was lighter, as if the weight on his shoulders had eased, even just a little. "Yeah," Barron said. "But I'll be back." Morales smirked. Most people don't say that after visiting a disaster zone. Barron smiled, but there was an unshakable determination in his eyes. "I'm not most people." Morales nodded, his expression thoughtful. "No, you're not." The captain extended his hand. Barron shook it firmly. "You're a good kid," Morales said. "A lot of people talk about change. Not many actually show up." Barron nodded. "People need to know that they're not alone, and I'll make sure they never feel like they are." As he stepped outside, a small group had gathered to say goodbye. Children waved, parents clapped. Someone even held up a sign that read, "Thank you, Barron." Then, just before he climbed into the car, he felt a tiny hand tug at his sleeve. He turned to see Emily, the little girl who had lost and found Max. He looked up at him, holding a picture she had drawn, a simple sketch of a boy, a golden retriever, and a burning house behind them. At the bottom she had written, "You brought the light back." Barron's chest tightened. He bent down, taking the drawing carefully. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered. "I'll keep this forever." She beamed, wrapping her small arms around him in a quick hug before running back to her mother. As Barron climbed into the car, he looked down at the picture once more. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As Barron Trump's plane ascended into the sky, leaving behind the smoke-hazed city of Los Angeles, he pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. Below, the sprawling landscape was a patchwork of devastation and resilience. Charred forests, skeletal remains of homes, and fire-ravaged streets stood side by side with relief centers, shelters, and pockets of hope. He wasn't leaving this behind. He was carrying it with him. His mind replayed everything that had happened over the past few days: the tearful reunions, the stories of loss, the silent prayers spoken in the dead of night. Most of all, he thought about the people. Emily, who had lost and found her best friend. Max. Sophia, who now held a small wooden cross as a symbol of strength. Captain Morales, who continued to fight despite the odds. A soft vibration in his pocket pulled him from his thoughts. It was his phone. A message from his mother, Melania. "Melania, proud of you, Barron. Call me when you land. Love you." He exhaled deeply. He knew his mother had been following his journey from the moment he first whispered that prayer in his bedroom. She had believed in him when no one else had even known what he was planning. But as much as he appreciated the support, he wasn't done yet. The moment Barron stepped off the jet in Florida, cameras were waiting. He hadn't planned on giving an interview, but the media had already caught wind of the relief fund's overwhelming success. The Rise Again Relief Fund had passed $10 million, with donations still pouring in from people all over the country. A journalist from a major news outlet pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Barron, you sparked a movement. People everywhere are saying your visit inspired them to give. How does that feel?" Barron paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not about me," he said finally. "It's about the families who lost everything. The firefighters risking their lives, and the volunteers working day and night to help. They're the ones who deserve the attention." Another reporter chimed in. "Many people are comparing you to your father, saying, 'You're showing early signs of leadership.' What do you think about that?" Barron's lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't about politics, and he wasn't going to let them turn it into that. "I think leadership is about showing up when it matters," he said. "And right now, what matters is making sure people in Los Angeles don't feel forgotten." The questions continued, but Barron excused himself, making his way to the waiting car. His security team ensured a smooth departure, but he could still hear the buzz of conversation behind him. They didn't understand. This wasn't about a headline or a moment. This was about changing the way people saw each other. That evening, Barron sat at his desk, scrolling through the fundraiser's latest updates. The number had climbed to $12,400,000. The donations weren't just coming from big names, they were coming from ordinary people. A retired teacher had given $20 with a note that read, "I wish I could give more. Bless you for what you've done." A group of middle schoolers had raised $500 through a bake sale, sending a photo of themselves holding a sign that said, "We stand with LA." Barron's chest tightened. This was bigger than he ever imagined. A knock at the door broke his focus. "Come in." His mother stepped inside, her expression soft. "How are you holding up?" Barron sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'm okay, I don't know. I didn't expect this." He gestured to the screen. "The way people are responding. It's incredible, but it also feels like there's more to do." Melania sat beside him, studying his face. "There is always more to do, Barron, but you have done more than enough for now." Barron shook his head. "It's not about enough. It's about making sure this doesn't just fade away." Melania reached for his hand. "And it won't, because you lit a fire in people's hearts, and that fire will keep burning long after the smoke in Los Angeles clears." Her words lingered in the air. A fire in people's hearts. That was it. Barron sat up straighter. "Mom, what if we make this permanent?" She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "A foundation," Barron said, the idea taking shape in his mind. "Not just a fundraiser, something long-term. Something that doesn't just help wildfire victims, but helps people rebuild after disasters anywhere in the country." Melania's eyes softened with pride. "That's a beautiful idea." Barron exhaled, his pulse quickening with determination. This wasn't just about Los Angeles anymore. This was about building something lasting. The movement wasn't going to stop here. It was just the beginning. The idea consumed Barron's mind in the hours after his conversation with Melania. A foundation, a lasting impact that wouldn't just fade away with the news cycle. Something permanent, something real. He knew that in a few weeks the headlines would move on, the world would forget, but the families who had lost everything wouldn't. As the night deepened, he found himself staring at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. Was he really capable of this? The fundraiser had been a success, but starting something bigger, something that would outlive a single tragedy, felt overwhelming. His phone vibrated, a message from Captain Morales. "You inspired my team. Your visit reminded us why we do this. If there's anything I can ever do, let me know." Barron exhaled, gripping his phone tightly. It wasn't about him. It was about the people still fighting, still rebuilding. He couldn't walk away now. The next morning, he wasted no time. Over breakfast, he sat down with his mother and began outlining the vision. "We don't just send money," he explained, his eyes burning with determination. "We work with firefighters, disaster relief teams, and rebuilding projects. We make sure families aren't forgotten once the cameras leave." Melania listened intently, nodding. "This will require structure, legal work, and people you trust." "I'll figure it out," Barron said firmly, "but I can't do it alone." "You won't have to," she assured him. With her help, Barron reached out to his father's former advisors, philanthropists, and business leaders. Some were skeptical at first. He was only 18 after all. But those who had seen what he had already accomplished didn't doubt him. Within a week, the Rising Hope Foundation was officially in motion. The same network that had spread his prayer now spread news of the organization's launch. Celebrities, politicians, and everyday Americans rallied behind it. And just when Barron thought it couldn't get any bigger, something unexpected happened. A video surfaced. A firefighter had recorded Barron's final prayer at the shelter in Los Angeles. The moment he had gathered with victims, hands clasped, eyes closed, asking for hope, strength, and healing. The video had already amassed over 100 million views. Comments flooded in. "We need more leaders like this. This young man restored my faith in humanity. This is what real compassion looks like." Barron wasn't just leading a fundraiser anymore. He had become a symbol of resilience. And in that moment, he knew he hadn't just responded to a crisis. He had started a movement. Barron Trump's journey from witnessing a disaster on television to becoming a symbol of hope and resilience is a reminder that true leadership isn't about titles, it's about action. His unwavering determination to help wildfire victims, his heartfelt prayers, and his decision to create a lasting impact through the Rising Hope Foundation prove that one person, no matter their age, can inspire real change. This story teaches us that compassion, courage, and faith can bring light to even the darkest moments. In today's world, where tragedies often seem overwhelming and distant, Barron's actions show us the power of stepping up, using our voices, and turning empathy into action. It's not about grand gestures, it's about doing what we can, where we are, with what we have. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Hit the like button, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and share this video with others. Together, we can spread hope and remind the world that kindness and resilience always matter. What would you have done in Barron's place? Let us know in the comments below.